When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the nation lay in ruins. American bombers had reduced 67 of its cities to ash and rubble. 2 atomic bombs had obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands in blinding flashes of nuclear fire. The once mighty Imperial Japanese military had been crushed, its aircraft carriers sunk, its armies scattered across the Pacific Islands where they had died by the hundreds of thousands. More than 3 million Japanese were dead. The economy had collapsed. Factories stood silent, their machinery rusted and broken. Rice production had fallen to barely half of pre-war levels, and millions faced starvation in the coming winter. The Zaibatsu, the powerful family conglomerates that had fueled Japan's war machine, controlled what little remained of the shattered economy. Emperor Hirohito, once revered as a living god, had just done the unthinkable by announcing Japan's surrender in his own voice, broadcast across the nation for the first time in history. As American forces prepared to occupy this devastated archipelago, few could have imagined what would unfold over the next 7 years. The story of how America transformed its most bitter Pacific enemy into a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous ally stands as one of history's most remarkable achievements. In this video, we will find out how this unprecedented transformation occurred. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan on August 30th, 1945, descending from his transport plane at Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo with a corncob pipe clenched between his teeth and aviator sunglasses shielding his eyes. The scene was pregnant with symbolism and danger. Japanese officers had warned him that they could not guarantee his safety, that rogue elements of the military might attempt assassination. MacArthur ignored these warnings with characteristic bravado, bringing only a small, unarmed advance party. His plane touched down on Japanese soil. He became the first foreign conqueror to set foot in Japan in more than 2,000 years of recorded history. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1880, MacArthur came from military aristocracy. His father, Arthur MacArthur, had won the Medal of Honor during the Civil War and later served as military governor of the Philippines. Young Douglas graduated first in his class from West Point in 1903, beginning a military career that would span half a century and 2 world wars. During World War I, he commanded the 42nd Rainbow Division in France, earning 7 Silver Stars and 2 Distinguished Service Crosses for his aggressive leadership under fire. Between the wars, he rose to become the youngest Chief of Staff of the United States Army, a position he held from 1930 to 1935. His tenure was marked by controversy, particularly his violent dispersal of the bonus Army veterans who had camped in Washington, demanding early payment of their service. Bonuses. In 1935, he accepted an appointment as military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth, a position that would place him at the center of the Pacific War's opening campaigns. When Japanese forces invaded the Philippines in December 1941, MacArthur commanded the defense of the islands with characteristic confidence that quickly crumbled into disaster. His air force was destroyed on the ground hours after the Pearl Harbor attack. His defensive strategy collapsed within weeks, and he was forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and then to the island fortress of Corregidor. In March 1942, under direct orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur abandoned his trapped forces and escaped to Australia in a PT boat, leaving behind 78,000 American and Filipino troops who would soon suffer the horrors of the Bataan Death March. His famous promise upon reaching Australia, "I shall return," became both a rallying cry and a source of bitter resentment among those he had left behind. But MacArthur did return, commanding the Southwest Pacific area throughout the war in a brilliant island-hopping campaign that bypassed Japanese strongholds and advanced inexorably toward the Japanese home islands. By the time Japan surrendered, he had redeemed his reputation through victories at New Guinea, the Philippines, and countless other Pacific battlefields. Now, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, MacArthur wielded authority unlike anything any American military officer had possessed since the Civil War. His powers were essentially unlimited. He answered directly to Washington, but operated with remarkable autonomy, ruling occupied Japan with the majesty of an American shogun. The Japanese government continued to function, but only at MacArthur's pleasure. He could and did order the arrest of anyone he deemed dangerous to the occupation. He controlled all economic policy, directed constitutional reforms, and reshaped Japanese society from top to bottom. He maintained his headquarters in the Daiichi Life Insurance Building, directly across from the Imperial Palace, a symbolic positioning that reinforced his dominant role. Yet MacArthur never set foot in the Imperial Palace, never demanded that Emperor Hirohito come to him in supplication. Instead, in a masterful bit of political theatre that would set the tone for the entire occupation, he arranged for the emperor to visit him at the American embassy on September 27, 1945. When Hirohito arrived expecting to be treated as a war criminal, MacArthur greeted him as a fellow head of state. The photograph of their meeting, deliberately released to the Japanese press, showed the emperor in formal morning dress, standing stiffly beside MacArthur, who stood casually in an open-collar khaki uniform without tie or decorations, hands on his hips. The image shocked Japan by showing their divine emperor reduced to a mortal man standing beside the supreme conqueror. But it also preserved Hirohito's dignity and position, a calculated decision that would prove crucial to the occupation's success. MacArthur understood what many in Washington did not, that removing the emperor would create chaos and resentment that could make Japan ungovernable. By working through the emperor and the existing government structure, he could implement revolutionary changes while maintaining social stability. The first challenge MacArthur faced was feeding Japan. The 1945 harvest had been devastated by the war, with rice production falling to barely 60% of normal levels. Industrial workers without food could not produce. Without production, the economy could not recover. Without economic recovery, democracy and reform would fail. MacArthur immediately ordered massive food imports from the United States, despite opposition from American officials who questioned whether taxpayer money should feed the enemy. Over the next several years, the United States shipped millions of tons of wheat, corn, and other foodstuffs to Japan, preventing mass starvation and creating goodwill that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. Japanese citizens, who had been told that Americans were barbaric monsters who would rape and pillage, instead found occupiers who fed their children and treated them with relative courtesy. This cognitive dissonance undermined years of militarist indoctrination more effectively than any re-education program. But MacArthur knew that food aid alone would not transform Japan. He needed to dismantle the political and economic structures that had enabled militarism and replace them with democratic institutions. The question was, how to achieve this without destroying what remained of Japanese society. The dismantling of Japan's military machine began immediately and proceeded with ruthless efficiency. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, which had numbered more than 7 million men at the war's peak, were completely dissolved. Officers who had commanded armies and fleets found themselves unemployed, their pensions cancelled, their status destroyed overnight. The elite were stripped of their power in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Weapons were collected and destroyed by the millions. Factories that had produced Zeros and battleships were ordered to convert to peaceful production or face closure. The massive Mitsubishi aircraft plants, the Kawasaki shipyards, the arsenals that had churned out tanks and artillery all fell silent. Military bases were dismantled, their barracks torn down, their training grounds converted to farmland. The entire infrastructure of Japanese militarism was systematically erased. Perhaps most dramatically, the occupation banned all military and paramilitary organizations, dissolved the secret police, and purged approximately 200,000 individuals from public life for their roles in promoting militarism. The purge extended from cabinet ministers to village officials, from newspaper editors to school principals. Anyone who had held a position of responsibility in militarist organizations faced investigation and possible removal. The purge was imperfect and sometimes arbitrary, but it sent an unmistakable message that the old order was finished. The economic reforms struck even more deeply at the foundations of Japanese society. The Zaibatsu, the giant family conglomerates like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda, had dominated the Japanese economy for decades. These combines controlled everything from banks to mining companies to trading firms, operating as semi-feudal empires within the larger economy. They had enthusiastically supported Japanese militarism and expansion, profiting enormously from the war. MacArthur ordered them broken up. The occupation authorities forced the Zaibatsu families to sell their shares, dissolved holding companies, and attempted to create a more competitive economy. The breakup was only partially successful, as many Zaibatsu components eventually reformed as keiretsu, looser business groupings that maintained many old relationships. But the symbolic impact was profound, demonstrating that even the most powerful economic interests were not immune to reform. Alongside the Zaibatsu dissolution, the occupation implemented the most radical land reform in Japanese history. Before the war, more than half of Japan's farmers were tenants, working land owned by absentee landlords and paying crushing rents that consumed half or more of their harvest. This system had persisted for centuries, creating a rural peasantry that lived in poverty and debt. The land reform, implemented between 1947 and 1950, forced landlords to sell all holdings above a small maximum to the government, which then resold the land to tenant farmers at minimal cost. Within 3 years, tenant farming dropped from 46% to 10% of Japanese agriculture. Millions of families received their own land for the first time, creating a class of conservative, property-owning farmers who would become a key constituency for Japan's post-war democracy. The psychological impact was as important as the economic effect. Farmers who had spent their lives bowing to landlords now owned their own fields, their own futures. This transformation helped ensure that Japan's rural areas, which had been hotbeds of militarist sentiment, became supporters of the new democratic order. The question of what to do about Emperor Hirohito represented the occupation's most delicate challenge. Many Americans, especially those who had fought in the Pacific, wanted the emperor tried as a war criminal. They saw him as ultimately responsible for Japan's aggression, its atrocities, its fanatical resistance that had cost so many lives. Australian and British Commonwealth forces, who had suffered terribly at Japanese hands, particularly in prisoner-of-war camps, demanded justice. The Soviet Union insisted that Hirohito face trial alongside other Axis leaders. In Japan itself, opinion was divided. Some Japanese, particularly intellectuals and leftists, saw the emperor system as the root of Japan's militarism and called for its abolition. But for most Japanese, the emperor remained a sacred figure, the living embodiment of the nation's soul. MacArthur made the controversial decision to protect Hirohito from prosecution. His reasoning was both pragmatic and strategic. Putting the emperor on trial, he believed, would outrage the Japanese people and make the occupation far more difficult, perhaps impossible. It might require hundreds of thousands of additional occupation troops to maintain order. More importantly, MacArthur saw the emperor as a tool for implementing reforms. Hirohito's endorsement of democracy and pacifism carried weight that no American proclamation could match. The decision to shield Hirohito remains controversial to this day, with critics arguing that justice was sacrificed for convenience, but MacArthur's gamble paid off in terms of the occupation's success. On January 1, 1946, Emperor Hirohito took the extraordinary step of publicly renouncing his divinity. In a carefully crafted imperial rescript, he declared that the ties between himself and his people were not based on myth and legend, not on the concept that the emperor was divine and the Japanese people superior to other races. The statement, known as the Humanity Declaration, shook Japanese society to its core. For more than 2,000 years, Japanese emperors had claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and official state Shinto had taught that the emperor was Arahitogami, a living god. Now Hirohito himself had declared this false. The psychological impact was devastating for some, liberating for others. Older Japanese who had been raised to worship the emperor felt their world collapse. Younger Japanese, particularly those who had experienced the war's horrors, often felt relief. The declaration cleared the way for a more rational, secular society and eliminated one of the main pillars of militarist ideology. But it also created a crisis of meaning for millions who had defined their lives through devotion to the divine emperor. How were they to understand themselves and their nation if the fundamental belief that had structured their society was revealed as mere myth? The creation of a new constitution represented the occupation's most ambitious attempt to reshape Japanese political culture. MacArthur's instructions to his staff were clear: draft a constitution that would prevent Japan from ever again becoming a military threat while establishing the foundations for democratic government. The government section of SCAP, led by General Courtney Whitney, worked in secret for about a week in February 1946 to produce a draft constitution. The speed was necessary because the Japanese government, tasked with drafting its own constitutional reforms, had produced only minor modifications to the Meiji Constitution that preserved the emperor's theoretically unlimited powers and made few concessions to democracy. MacArthur rejected this conservative document and presented the Japanese government with the American draft as a non-negotiable basis for discussion. The Japanese were stunned by the radical nature of the American proposals. The new constitution would reduce the emperor to a mere symbol of the state with no governing powers. It would establish a British-style parliamentary system with a bicameral legislature and a prime minister answerable to the Diet. It would grant unprecedented rights to women, including suffrage and equal legal status. Most controversially, it would include Article 9, which forever renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and prohibited Japan from maintaining land, sea, or air forces. The Japanese negotiators argued, pleaded, and tried to water down the American draft, but MacArthur held firm on the essential points. After months of debate and revision, the new constitution was promulgated on November 3, 1946, and took effect on May 3, 1947. It remains in force today, unrevised, one of the longest-lasting constitutions in the world. Article 9 deserves particular attention because it represents such a radical departure from normal international practice. The full text reads, "Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes." In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. This pacifist clause was partly MacArthur's idealism, partly a practical measure to prevent Japanese rearmament, and partly a response to Asian nations' fears of Japanese militarism. The irony is that Article 9 was imposed by the American military, and within a few years, as the Cold War intensified, the United States would pressure Japan to rearm and interpret Article 9 to allow self-defense forces. But in 1947, the article represented a bold experiment in constitutional pacifism that resonated deeply with the Japanese people exhausted by war. Many Japanese embraced Article 9 as a sacred commitment, a guarantee that their children would never again be sent to die in pointless wars of conquest. Over the decades, Article 9 has become perhaps the most cherished part of the Constitution for many Japanese, despite repeated American and conservative Japanese efforts to revise it. The social reforms imposed by the occupation cut even deeper than political changes. The status of women in Japanese society had been defined by centuries of Confucian tradition and feudal custom. Women could not vote, could not own property in their own names, could not divorce their husbands regardless of abuse or abandonment, could not choose their own careers. They were expected to be obedient daughters, then obedient wives, then obedient mothers who raised sons for the state. The new constitution and supporting laws demolished this entire system. Women received the vote in 1946 and used it in the first post-war elections, with 39 women winning seats in the Diet. Marriage law was reformed to require consent from both parties, to allow divorce initiated by either spouse, and to eliminate the traditional patriarchal family system where the male household head controlled all family members. Women gained the right to own property, to enter into contracts, to pursue education and careers. The occupation actively promoted women's rights through education, propaganda, and legal reforms. American women officers in the occupation forces served as role models and advisors to Japanese women's organizations. These changes met fierce resistance from conservative Japanese men, who saw them as an assault on Japanese culture and tradition. But they also unleashed enormous energy and talent that had been suppressed for generations. Japanese women became teachers, journalists, politicians, and business leaders. The transformation was not complete. Discrimination and social pressure remained, but the legal foundation for equality had been established. The textile industry's transformation under occupation illustrates how Japanese companies adapted to peace and leveraged their strengths. Before the war, Japanese textiles had been major export earners, with silk and cotton fabrics sold around the world. The industry had declined during the war as resources were diverted to military production, workers were conscripted, and export markets were cut off. After the war, textile companies found themselves with damaged equipment, shortages of raw materials, and uncertain markets. Cotton had to be imported since Japan grew little of it, requiring precious foreign exchange. Silk. Production required mulberry trees and silkworm cultivation that had been neglected during the war. Labor was available since millions of repatriates and demobilized soldiers needed work, but they were malnourished and weak. Despite these challenges, the textile industry recovered quickly. Companies like Toyo Spinning, Kanebo, and Teijin rebuilt their plants, imported raw cotton using American aid and credits, and resumed production. The Korean War provided a massive boost, with American forces ordering uniforms, blankets, and other textile goods. Japanese textile workers, mostly women working long hours for low wages, produced goods competitive in quality and price with anything made elsewhere. The industry's success in the 1950s provided employment for hundreds of thousands, earned foreign exchange, and demonstrated that Japan could compete in international markets. By the late 1950s, Japanese synthetic fiber production was growing rapidly, with companies investing in nylon, polyester, and other chemical fibers. The shift from natural to synthetic fibers required technical expertise, capital investment, and cooperation between textile companies and chemical companies, illustrating the sophisticated industrial networks developing in Japan. Tetsu Katayama served as Japan's prime minister from May 1947 to March 1948, leading a coalition government that represented the Socialist Party's only period in power during the occupation. Born in 1887, Katayama had studied law at Tokyo Imperial University and practiced as a lawyer before entering politics. He was a Christian, unusual in predominantly Buddhist and Shinto Japan, and his faith influenced his commitment to social reform and pacifism. Katayama had been elected to the Diet in 1930 and had opposed militarism during the 1930s, though not actively enough to face serious persecution. After the war, he led the Social Democratic Party, which won the most seats in the April 1947 elections. His coalition government faced enormous challenges, continuing food shortages, inflation, labor unrest, and the difficult task of implementing occupation reforms while maintaining public support. Katayama supported the new constitution and democratic reforms, but pushed for more aggressive economic intervention and social welfare programs than the occupation authorities favored. His government implemented some progressive policies, including expanded social insurance and stronger labor protections, but struggled to address the economic crisis. The coalition fell apart after less than a year due to internal conflicts between socialists and more conservative coalition partners. Katayama's brief tenure demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of democratic politics in occupied Japan. The socialists would never again lead a government during the occupation period, as conservative forces consolidated power with American support. Katayama himself remained active in politics, serving in the Diet, until his death in 1978, witnessing the transformation he had helped initiate. The reconstruction of Tokyo illustrates the massive physical rebuilding required across Japan. The capital had been devastated by American bombing, particularly the firebombing raids of March 1945 that killed over 100,000 people and destroyed vast areas of the city. When the occupation began, much of Tokyo was rubble, with an estimated 40% of the urban area destroyed. The Imperial Palace had survived, as American bombers had deliberately avoided it, but surrounding commercial and residential areas were devastated. Survivors lived in makeshift shelters, burned-out buildings, and shanty towns constructed from scavenged materials. The occupation headquarters took over the Daiichi building and other structures that had survived the bombing, but most of Tokyo needed to be completely rebuilt. The reconstruction proceeded gradually over years, constrained by shortages of materials and capital. Wood remained the primary building material for most structures since Japan had limited cement and steel production. This created fire hazards, and fires remained common in the early post-war period. The city's infrastructure required massive investment. Water mains, sewers, electrical lines, and telephone cables needed repair or replacement. Streets required paving and widening to accommodate the vehicles that would eventually fill them. The reconstruction followed no comprehensive plan, with buildings rising wherever owners could afford to build them, and zoning regulations were minimal. The result was the chaotic but vibrant urban landscape that characterizes Tokyo today, where modern skyscrapers stand next to small wooden houses, where narrow alleys wind between wide boulevards, where planning and improvisation coexist in constant tension. The rebuilding of Tokyo and other Japanese cities represented an enormous collective effort that absorbed resources, labor, and attention throughout the occupation period and beyond. Ichiro Hatoyama represents a different strand of conservative Japanese politics during the occupation. Born in 1883 into a prominent political family, Hatoyama had been educated at Tokyo Imperial University and pursued a political career serving in the Diet from 1915 and holding various cabinet positions. He was conservative and nationalist, but also opposed to military dominance of government, which made him suspect to the militarists but acceptable to the occupation. Hatoyama was initially chosen to become Prime Minister in 1946, but MacArthur purged him just days before he was to take office, apparently due to speeches Hatoyama had given in the 1930s that were deemed too nationalist. The purge shocked Japanese conservatives who thought Hatoyama's record made him safe. It demonstrated that the occupation could and would remove anyone it found objectionable, regardless of democratic procedures. Hatoyama spent the next 5 years in political exile, unable to hold office but working behind the scenes to influence conservative politics. When the occupation ended and the purge was lifted, he returned to active politics, eventually becoming Prime Minister from 1954 to 1956. His government worked to revise aspects of the occupation legacy that conservatives found objectionable, including strengthening the police, restricting labor unions, and pursuing constitutional revision. Hatoyama's career arc illustrates the continuity between pre-war and post-war conservative politics, the limits of occupation reform, and the resilience of Japanese political elites who waited out the occupation and resumed power afterwards. The fishing industry faced unique challenges during and after the occupation. Japanese fishing fleets had been crucial to national food security and export earnings before the war. During the war, many fishing boats were requisitioned for military use or sunk by Allied submarines and aircraft. Fishermen were drafted into military service or impressed into transporting troops and supplies. When the war ended, the fishing industry was shattered, with most boats destroyed, fishermen dead or scattered, and waters around Japan filled with mines that made fishing dangerous. The occupation authorities initially restricted Japanese fishing to waters close to shore, fearing that fishing boats might be used to evacuate war criminals or transport contraband. These restrictions created hardship for coastal communities that depended on fishing for survival. Gradually, the restrictions were relaxed as occupation authorities recognized that fish were essential to Japanese nutrition and that fishing provided employment for hundreds of thousands. American minesweepers helped clear Japanese waters, making fishing safer. Fishing boats were rebuilt using American aid materials and Japanese labor. The industry recovered, providing crucial protein to supplement the rice-based diet and reviving coastal communities. By the 1950s, Japanese fishing fleets ranged across the Pacific, using modern equipment and techniques to compete with fishing nations worldwide. The recovery of the fishing industry contributed to improved nutrition, economic growth, and restoration of a traditional way of life that had sustained Japanese coastal communities for centuries. The role of Japanese women in the immediate post-war period extended beyond the legal reforms to include their labor in rebuilding the country. With millions of men dead, disabled, or still awaiting repatriation, women became the primary labor force in many sectors. They cleared rubble from bombed cities, working with simple tools to break up concrete and salvage bricks and metal. They worked in fields, planting and harvesting crops without mechanical equipment or draft animals. They operated small businesses, selling goods in street markets or running shops and restaurants. They worked in factories that were rebuilding production capacity, often in dangerous conditions with inadequate safety equipment. Some women, driven by desperate poverty, turned to prostitution, serving American servicemen in bars and brothels near military bases. The polite term was Recreation and Amusement Association workers, but the reality was often exploitation and degradation. These women faced harsh moral judgment from other Japanese while providing services that occupation authorities tacitly accepted as necessary to prevent rape and maintain order. The Women and Children's Bureau, established in the Labour Ministry in 1947, attempted to protect women workers and improve their conditions, but it had limited resources and enforcement power. Despite the hardships, this period of female labour force participation created precedents and challenged assumptions about women's capabilities. Women who had managed businesses, supported families, and rebuilt cities proved that they could do work traditionally reserved for men. This experience would contribute to the gradual expansion of women's economic participation in subsequent decades, though progress would be slow and uneven. The development of Japan's automotive industry during the occupation period laid foundations for the global dominance Japanese car companies would later achieve. In 1945, Japan's automotive industry barely existed. A few companies like Toyota and Nissan had produced trucks for the military, but production was tiny compared to American or European manufacturers. The occupation initially prohibited automobile production for private use, allowing only trucks and buses needed for reconstruction. Japanese companies chafed at these restrictions but complied while secretly planning for the day when private car production would be permitted. Toyota, led by Kiichiro Toyoda, struggled financially during the early occupation years, nearly going bankrupt in 1949. The company was saved by Korean War procurement orders for trucks and by bank loans, arranged by government officials who saw automotive manufacturing as strategically important. The experience taught Toyota valuable lessons about quality control, efficiency, and the need to maintain financial discipline. The company's engineers studied American production methods, particularly Ford's assembly line techniques, but also began developing innovations suited to Japanese conditions. With limited space, capital, and resources, Japanese manufacturers could not simply copy American mass production. They needed to produce smaller volumes more efficiently with less waste. These constraints drove innovation in manufacturing methods that would later be codified as the Toyota production system and lean manufacturing. Nissan, Toyota's main rival, followed a similar path, struggling through the early post-war years before benefiting from Korean War orders and beginning to develop its own production capabilities. By the time the occupation ended, Japanese automotive companies were producing tens of thousands of vehicles annually, a tiny fraction of American or European production, but growing steadily. The foundation was being laid for the automotive revolution that would transform global manufacturing in subsequent decades. Religious organizations played complex roles during the occupation period, adapting to new freedoms while navigating the disestablishment of state Shinto. Buddhist temples and organizations which had been subordinated to Shinto during the war years found themselves with new independence, but also with reduced government support. Some Buddhist leaders embraced the opportunity to pursue religious missions without state interference. Others struggled with the loss of prestige and resources that came with disestablishment. Christian churches, which had faced persecution during the war for their foreign connections and refusal to worship at Shinto shrines, experienced a brief period of growth and influence during the occupation. American missionaries returned to Japan in large numbers, and some Japanese associated Christianity with American power and modernity. Emperor Hirohito's renunciation of divinity and embrace of science over myth seemed to validate Christian teachings about the nature of deity and reality. However, Christian growth remained limited, with converts never exceeding about 2% of the population. Most Japanese found Christianity too foreign, too demanding in its exclusive truth claims, too different from the syncretic approach that allowed Japanese to participate in both Shinto and Buddhist practices without seeing them as contradictory. New religious movements, some blending elements of Shinto, Buddhism, and Christianity, attracted followers searching for meaning in the post-war chaos. Soka Gakkai, a Buddhist lay organization that would become one of Japan's largest religious movements, grew rapidly during this period by offering community, purpose, and practical benefits to people struggling with poverty and dislocation. The transformation of Japanese agriculture extended beyond land reform to include modernization of farming methods and rural life. Before the war, Japanese farming had been extraordinarily labor-intensive, with farmers using simple tools and draft animals to work small plots. Yields per acre were high due to intensive cultivation, but productivity per farmer was low because methods were traditional and unchanging. The occupation authorities and Japanese agricultural experts promoted modern farming techniques, improved seeds, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, and scientific agriculture. American agricultural advisors demonstrated tractors, mechanical planters and harvesters, and other equipment. Chemical companies began producing fertilizers that could increase yields beyond what organic methods achieved. Agricultural extension services spread knowledge of new techniques to farmers who had farmed the same way for generations. The transformation proceeded gradually, limited by farmers' poverty and conservatism. A farmer with 2 or 3 acres could not justify buying a tractor. Chemical fertilizers required cash that subsistence farmers lacked. but over time, as farmers prospered from owning their land and as government programs provided credit and subsidies, modernization spread. Rice yields increased steadily as improved varieties and better fertilization raised productivity. Rural electrification brought power for pumps, lights, and eventually household appliances that reduced the backbreaking labor of rural life. The transformation of Japanese agriculture from feudal to modern was not complete by the occupation's end, but the process was well underway, creating the foundation for the productive, mechanized agriculture that would free labor for industrial work while feeding a growing population. The coal mining industry illustrates the harsh conditions and labor conflicts that characterize some sectors of the economy during occupation. Coal was essential for generating electricity, producing steel, and powering factories. Without adequate coal production, the entire economy would stall. But coal mining was dangerous, difficult work that miners performed in terrible conditions for low pay. Mines were often poorly ventilated, prone to cave-ins and explosions, and operators prioritized production over safety. Miners, many of whom had been forced laborers during the war, including Korean and Chinese workers, organized unions and struck for better pay and conditions. The occupation authorities supported workers' right to organize but also pressured them to maintain production essential to recovery. This created tension between occupation officials who promoted labor rights and those who prioritized economic recovery. Coal miners struck repeatedly during the late 1940s, demanding wage increases to keep pace with inflation and better safety measures to prevent deaths and injuries. Some strikes turned violent, with miners occupying pits and clashing with police sent to break strikes. The conflicts revealed the limits of occupation support for labor unions when union demands threatened economic priorities. Eventually, wages improved and conditions got somewhat better as coal companies recognized they needed to attract and retain workers. But mining remained dangerous and difficult, and the industry would decline in the 1950s and 1960s as Japan shifted to oil for energy. The miners who powered Japan's recovery in the late 1940s would find themselves unemployed or forced into other work as the energy economy transformed. The chemical industry's development during the occupation period provided essential materials for other industries and demonstrated Japanese capabilities in complex manufacturing. Chemical companies like Mitsubishi Chemical, Sumitomo Chemical, and Mitsui Chemical had produced military materials during the war, including explosives, poison gases, and synthetic fuels. The occupation ordered the destruction of facilities for producing military chemicals and prohibited research on certain substances. But civilian chemical production was encouraged and even supported. Companies shifted to producing fertilizers, plastics, synthetic fibers, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemicals. This required technical expertise, capital investment, and access to raw materials, all of which were in short supply. Japanese chemical engineers worked with limited resources to restart production and develop processes suited to Japanese conditions. Some received training in American chemical plants or studied American technical literature. The industry grew slowly in the late 1940s, but accelerated in the 1950s as the economy recovered and demand increased. Chemical companies collaborated with textile manufacturers to produce synthetic fibers, with pharmaceutical companies to produce new medicines, with agricultural companies to produce pesticides and herbicides. The industry's growth supported development of other sectors and demonstrated that Japan could compete in sophisticated manufacturing, requiring scientific knowledge and technical precision. The education system received similarly radical treatment. Before the war, Japanese schools had been instruments of ultra-nationalist indoctrination. Textbooks taught that the emperor was divine, that Japan was destined to rule Asia, that death in service to the state was the highest honor. Military officers taught in schools, drilling students in martial values and unquestioning obedience. The curriculum emphasized rote memorization and reverence for authority over critical thinking. History was distorted to glorify Japanese aggression and vilify foreign nations. Geography lessons focused on Japan's supposed need for living space and resources. Ethics courses taught absolute loyalty to the emperor and contempt for individualism or democracy. The occupation dismantled this entire system with shocking speed. More than 100,000 teachers and administrators were purged for promoting militarist education. Textbooks were confiscated and destroyed, their most egregious passages literally blacked out with ink, while new books were prepared. The Ministry of Education was reorganized and stripped of its authoritarian powers. The new educational policy emphasized democratic values, individual development, and critical thinking. Schools were required to teach about human rights, peaceful international cooperation, and the horrors of war. American education officers worked with Japanese reformers to create a new curriculum modeled partly on American progressive education theory. The system was democratized by making local school boards elected rather than appointed from Tokyo. Co-education was introduced, shocking conservative Japanese who believed boys and girls should be educated separately. The changes produced resistance and confusion, but they also created space for a generation of Japanese to grow up with fundamentally different values than their parents. The war crimes trials represented the occupation's attempt to achieve justice for Japanese atrocities, while establishing a historical record of Japan's aggression. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo Trials, opened on May 3, 1946, in the former Imperial Japanese Army headquarters. 28 of Japan's top wartime leaders faced charges of crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The defendants included former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into war with the United States. Also on trial were generals who had commanded armies in China and Southeast Asia, admirals who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, diplomats who had negotiated while preparing for war, and government ministers who had run Japan's war economy. The trials lasted 2.5 years, heard testimony from more than 400 witnesses, and examined thousands of documents. The proceedings were conducted in both English and Japanese, with simultaneous translation that often struggled to convey complex legal concepts across vastly different linguistic and cultural frameworks. The prosecutors, led by American Joseph Keenan, faced the challenge of applying Western legal concepts to Japanese actions while navigating the political complexities of the occupation. The tribunal's legitimacy was questioned from the start. Defense lawyers argued that it represented victors' justice, that the Allies who had firebombed Japanese cities and dropped atomic bombs had no moral standing to judge Japanese war crimes. They challenged the very concept of crimes against peace, arguing that aggressive war, however immoral, had not been illegal under international law when Japan launched its invasions. Some defendants argued they had simply followed orders or acted in accordance with Japanese military tradition. Others claimed ignorance of atrocities committed by forces under their command. A few expressed remorse, but most remained defiant or silent. The trials ultimately sentenced 7 defendants to death by hanging, including Tojo, who had attempted suicide rather than face trial, but survived to be executed on December 23, 1948. 16 received life imprisonment, and 2 received lesser sentences. 2 defendants died during the proceedings, and 1 was found mentally incompetent to stand trial. Beyond the Tokyo trials, the occupation conducted more than 2,000 other war crimes trials across Asia and the Pacific, prosecuting approximately 5,700 individuals for atrocities ranging from the Bataan Death March to the Burma Railway to countless massacres of civilians and prisoners. These trials were often more straightforward than Tokyo, focusing on specific atrocities rather than abstract concepts of aggressive war. American, British, Australian, Chinese, and other allied. Military courts heard evidence of torture, murder, starvation, and abuse. The trials revealed horrors that shocked even those who had fought in the war. Evidence emerged of medical experiments on prisoners, forced labor that killed thousands, mass executions, cannibalism of Allied prisoners, and systematic rape. The proceedings were not always fair by modern standards. Some trials were hasty, some evidence was questionable, some defendants may have been innocent or less culpable than charged. But they established a precedent for holding military and political leaders accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity, principles that would later be codified in international law. The trials also served an educational function for the Japanese public, forcing a confrontation with atrocities that many had refused to believe. Newspapers published detailed accounts of massacres in China, mistreatment of prisoners of war, and other crimes. Many Japanese were genuinely shocked, having believed wartime propaganda that portrayed their military as liberators of Asia from Western colonialism. What role did Japanese officials play in implementing the occupation's reforms? The answer reveals both the pragmatism of the occupation and the complexity of Japan's transformation. While MacArthur held supreme authority, he governed through the existing Japanese bureaucracy rather than attempting direct military rule. This meant that Japanese government officials actually implemented most occupation reforms, often with considerable discretion in how they carried out American directives. Some Japanese embraced the reforms as an opportunity to modernize their country. Progressive politicians, bureaucrats, and intellectuals who had been marginalized during the militarist period now found themselves empowered by the occupation. They worked enthusiastically to promote democracy, women's rights, labor unions, and other reforms that aligned with their own long-held beliefs. Others cooperated reluctantly, implementing reforms they privately opposed because they had no choice. Still others engaged in subtle resistance, following the letter of occupation directives while undermining their spirit. The Japanese bureaucracy proved remarkably adept at absorbing American pressure while maintaining continuity with pre-war practices and attitudes. Many of the same officials who had served the militarist government continued in their positions, having escaped the purges or been deemed necessary for administrative continuity. This created a paradox at the heart of the occupation. Revolutionary reforms were being implemented by conservative bureaucrats who often disagreed with them. Shigeru Yoshida emerged as the central Japanese political figure of the occupation period and the early post-war era. Born in 1878 to a prominent family, Yoshida had pursued a diplomatic career rather than a military one, serving in various posts including ambassador to Italy and the United Kingdom before the war. His moderate views and opposition to the military's dominance had made him suspect in the eyes of the wartime regime, and he had been briefly imprisoned in 1945 for allegedly participating in peace overtures. This record of resistance, however limited, made him acceptable to the occupation authorities. Yoshida became foreign minister in the first post-war cabinet and then prime minister in May 1946. He would serve as prime minister for most of the period from 1946 to 1954, becoming the dominant figure in Japanese politics during the crucial reconstruction years. Yoshida understood how to work with MacArthur and the occupation authorities, accepting reforms he could not prevent while quietly resisting or modifying those he found most objectionable. He was fundamentally conservative, valuing stability and tradition, but pragmatic enough to recognize that Japan needed to change to survive. His relationship with MacArthur was complex, combining genuine respect with calculated deference. Yoshida understood that MacArthur's ego responded well to flattery and ceremony, and he played to this weakness while pursuing his own agenda. At the same time, Yoshida genuinely believed that Japan's best course was to align with the United States, accept American security protection, and focus on economic recovery rather than rearmament. This approach, later called the Yoshida Doctrine, would guide Japanese foreign policy for decades. The economic miracle that transformed Japan from devastated ruins to the world's second-largest economy did not happen accidentally or overnight. It required deliberate policies, massive American aid, fortuitous timing, and the determined effort of the Japanese people. In the immediate post-war period, Japan's economy was catastrophic. Industrial production in 1946 stood at barely 30% of pre-war levels. Inflation raged out of control, with prices increasing by thousands of percent. The black market dominated economic activity, with everything from food to clothing to industrial goods changing hands outside official channels. Workers received wages in nearly worthless currency and spent their days searching for food rather than producing goods. The occupation's initial economic policy made things worse. American trustbusters, determined to break up the zaibatsu and promote competition, disrupted established business relationships without creating functional replacements. Reparations demands from Asian nations victimized by Japan threatened to strip the country of what little industrial capacity remained. The situation was dire enough that some American observers questioned whether Japan could ever recover economically. The turning point came with the reverse course of 1948. As the Cold War intensified and China fell to the communists, American priorities shifted. Instead of punishing Japan, the United States now sought to build it into a stable, prosperous anti-communist ally. The zaibatsu breakup was relaxed, reparations demands were scaled back. An American policy focused on promoting economic recovery rather than implementing reforms. Joseph Dodge, a Detroit banker, arrived in Japan in February 1949 as financial advisor to SCAP with instructions to stabilize the economy and end inflation. The Dodge Line, as his policies became known, imposed harsh austerity measures that slashed government spending, balanced the budget, and set a fixed exchange rate of 360 yen to the dollar. The immediate impact was a severe recession. Unemployment rose sharply as inefficient companies collapsed and government subsidies ended. But the Dodge Line also wrung inflation out of the economy and created a stable foundation for future growth. Businesses could now plan for the future, knowing that currency values would remain stable. Foreign trade became possible at realistic exchange rates. The medicine was bitter, but it worked. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, provided the next crucial stimulus to Japan's economy. American forces fighting in Korea needed supplies, repairs, and services, and Japan was the obvious source. The United States poured money into the Japanese economy, ordering everything from trucks to textiles to ammunition. Japanese factories that had been idle or operating at minimal capacity suddenly ran around the clock to meet American demand. The special procurements, as these orders were called, pumped billions of dollars into Japan's economy and provided the capital and experience that Japanese companies needed to modernize and expand. Between 1950 and 1953, Japan received approximately $4 billion in special procurement orders, an enormous sum that jump-started the recovery and helped create the infrastructure for rapid growth. Japanese businessmen, with characteristic energy and attention to quality, not only met American demands but learned American production methods and quality control techniques. The Korean war boom convinced many Japanese that their future lay in export-oriented manufacturing rather than imperial conquest. They could prosper by making goods the world wanted to buy, not by seizing territory and resources. The question of labor unions and workers' rights presented another complex challenge for the occupation. Pre-war Japan had suppressed labor unions as dangerous to social harmony and state security. Workers had few rights, worked long hours for low pay, and faced dismissal or worse if they attempted to organize. The occupation actively promoted labor unions as essential to democracy and social justice. The trade union law of 1945 granted workers the right to organize, bargain collectively, and strike. The Labor Relations Adjustment Law and the Labor Standards Law followed in 1946 and 1947, establishing procedures for resolving disputes and setting minimum standards for wages, hours, and working conditions. The impact was dramatic and immediate. Union membership exploded, from essentially zero to nearly 7 million workers by 1949. Workers struck for higher wages, better conditions, and political goals. Some strikes turned violent, with workers occupying factories and clashing with police. Left-wing unions, often led by communists or socialists, saw themselves as revolutionary vanguards rather than simple economic organizations. They challenged not just individual employers but the entire capitalist system and Japan's alignment with the United States. MacArthur, who had promoted unions as democratic institutions, became alarmed at their radicalism and political activism. In 1947, he prohibited a planned general strike that would have shut down the entire country, arguing that it would harm reconstruction efforts. The occupation began cracking down on communist influence in unions, purging leaders and encouraging the formation of more moderate, enterprise-based unions. This shift reflected the broader reverse course in occupation policy, but also revealed the limits of American commitment to worker power. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department provides a fascinating case study in institutional transformation under occupation. Before the war, Japanese police had been a feared instrument of state control. The Kempeitai military police and the Toko Special Hire Police had arrested dissidents, tortured suspects, and suppressed any hint of opposition to militarism. Local police enforced thought control, monitored neighborhoods for suspicious activity, and maintained detailed records on citizens' political beliefs and associations. The occupation dissolved the Kempeitai and Toko, purged thousands of police officers, and restructured the entire system. The new police were supposed to be servants of the public rather than agents of state control. They were decentralized, with local governments controlling local police, rather than a national force taking orders from Tokyo. Officers received training in democratic policing, methods that emphasized protecting rights rather than suppressing dissent. American police advisors worked to transform the culture of Japanese policing with mixed results. Many officers, particularly younger ones, embraced the new approach and took pride in serving their communities. Others simply waited out the occupation, maintaining old attitudes beneath a veneer of democratic rhetoric. The purge of police was less thorough than it should have been, with many officers who had participated in wartime repression remaining on the force. Still, the transformation of the police from feared oppressors to relatively trusted public servants represented a genuine achievement, one that would contribute to Japan's remarkably low crime rates in the post-war decades. Religious freedom represented another area where occupation reforms challenged centuries of Japanese tradition and practice. State Shinto, the official quasi-religion that had taught emperor worship and Japanese racial superiority, was abolished. The Shinto Directive of December 1945 ordered the complete separation of religion and state, ended government support for Shinto shrines, prohibited teaching Shinto in schools, and required that Shinto become a private religion like any other. Millions of Japanese who had prayed at Shinto shrines and participated in Shinto rituals had to confront questions about what they actually believed. Some found the disestablishment of Shinto liberating, an end to forced participation in ceremonies they had never believed in. Others felt that an essential part of Japanese culture was being destroyed by foreign occupiers. The occupation also promoted freedom for minority religions that had been suppressed or persecuted during the war. Christians, Buddhists, and new religious movements could now practice freely without fear of state interference. The result was a flourishing of religious diversity and experimentation, as Japanese explored spiritual alternatives to state Shinto. Some of the new religions that emerged or grew during this period combined elements of Shinto, Buddhism, and Christianity in creative ways that reflected the social upheaval and search for meaning in post-war Japan. The question of what happened to Shinto itself is complex. Shrine Shinto continued as a private religion, with citizens free to visit shrines, participate in festivals, and observe traditional rituals. But the nationalist, militarist elements of state Shinto were officially eliminated, and Shinto priests could no longer claim government authority or state support. The treatment of war criminals' families reveals another dimension of the occupation's impact on Japanese society. When men were arrested, tried, and executed or imprisoned for war crimes, their families faced social ostracism and economic hardship. Wives and children of executed war criminals bore the shame of their relatives' crimes while struggling to survive in a society that had lost much of its traditional social support network. Some families received support from conservative groups that viewed the executed men as martyrs rather than criminals. Others suffered in isolation, unable to escape the stigma of their association with the defeated regime. The occupation authorities generally did not persecute families of war criminals beyond the natural consequences of losing a breadwinner, but neither did they provide much assistance. This created bitter resentment in some quarters and contributed to a strand of Japanese historical revisionism that would claim the war crimes trials were unfair and the executed men were innocent victims of victors' justice. The children of executed war criminals faced particular difficulties, growing up with the knowledge that their fathers had been hanged as criminals by the occupation authorities. Some changed their names to escape the association. Others became activists seeking to rehabilitate their fathers' reputations. The psychological impact rippled through generations, creating complex family dynamics around questions of guilt, responsibility, and national identity. The pharmaceutical industry's transformation during the occupation helped improve public health and demonstrated Japanese capabilities in scientific manufacturing. Before the war, Japan had produced some pharmaceuticals domestically, but relied heavily on imports of advanced medicines, particularly from Germany and Switzerland. During the war, these imports were cut off, forcing Japanese companies to develop domestic production capacity. After the war, pharmaceutical companies faced shortages of raw materials, damaged facilities, and urgent demand for medicines to treat disease and injury. The occupation authorities, concerned about epidemics that could spread to occupation forces, supported pharmaceutical production and provided some raw materials and technical assistance. Japanese companies like Takeda, Daiichi Sankyo, and Shionogi rebuilt production capacity and began manufacturing antibiotics, vaccines, and other essential medicines. The occupation authorities also relaxed patents on some foreign medicines, allowing Japanese companies to produce them without paying royalties. A controversial decision that benefited Japanese industry but angered Western pharmaceutical companies. By the early 1950s, Japanese pharmaceutical production was meeting most domestic needs and beginning to export to other Asian markets. The industry's success contributed to the dramatic improvements in Japanese public health during the occupation period and demonstrated Japan's capacity for science-based manufacturing. The aluminum industry's development illustrates how some industrial sectors emerged almost from nothing during the occupation period. Japan had limited aluminum production before the war, relying on imports for this strategic material used in aircraft and other military applications. The occupation initially prohibited aluminum production as potentially useful for military purposes, but this restriction was relaxed as American policy shifted toward economic recovery. Japanese companies, recognizing that aluminum would be essential for many civilian applications, invested in smelting capacity using imported bauxite and domestically generated electricity. The industry faced challenges including high electricity costs, dependence on imported raw materials, and competition from established American and European producers. But Japanese companies persevered, developing efficient production methods and finding domestic markets in construction, transportation, and consumer goods. The aluminum industry's growth supported the development of other industries and provided employment in regions with cheap hydroelectric power. By the late 1950s, Japan had become a significant aluminum producer, though it would always struggle with high energy costs compared to countries with cheaper electricity. The lumber industry's experience during the occupation reveals both ecological costs and economic benefits of rapid growth. Japan's forests had been overcut during the war to provide timber for military construction and fuel for heating and cooking. After the war, reconstruction created enormous demand for lumber for housing, construction, and rebuilding. Japanese forestry companies and small operators cut timber as fast as they could, often with little regard for sustainable forestry practices. Hillsides were clear-cut, causing erosion and floods. Old-growth forests were harvested and replaced with fast-growing species or not replanted at all. The environmental damage would take decades to address and in some cases was irreversible. But the lumber provided essential materials for reconstruction and created employment in rural areas where other opportunities were scarce. The occupation authorities, focused on economic recovery, paid little attention to environmental consequences of rapid timber harvesting. This pattern of prioritizing economic growth over environmental protection would continue in subsequent decades as Japan industrialized rapidly, creating pollution and ecological damage that would eventually force a reckoning with the costs of unconstrained development. The publishing industry experienced perhaps the most direct transformation of any sector during the occupation. Before and during the war, Japanese publishing had been strictly controlled by government censors who banned any content deemed dangerous to the state or emperor. Publishers who violated censorship rules faced closure, confiscation of materials, and arrest. Books, magazines, and newspapers presented only officially approved views, creating an intellectual monoculture that stifled creativity and debate. The occupation abolished pre-war censorship but imposed its own, prohibiting militarist and ultra-nationalist content while allowing and encouraging democratic and liberal ideas. Publishers suddenly had freedom to print material that would have been unthinkable during the war. Criticism of the emperor system, discussions of democracy and human rights, translations of Western political philosophy and literature. The publishing industry exploded with new magazines, newspapers, and books exploring ideas and topics that had been forbidden. Quality varied widely, with serious intellectual journals existing alongside sensationalist magazines and pulp fiction. Literacy rates in Japan were already high, and the hunger for new information and entertainment created a booming market for print media. Publishers who had survived the war by producing propaganda now competed to produce content that satisfied readers freed from wartime restrictions. Some publishers pushed the boundaries of occupation censorship, testing how far they could go in criticizing the occupation itself, or advocating for ideas that American authorities found problematic. The resulting cat-and-mouse game between publishers and censors created space for increasingly diverse expression even within occupation constraints. The machine tool industry's development during the occupation provided essential equipment for other manufacturing sectors and demonstrated Japanese precision manufacturing capabilities. Machine tools, lathes, milling machines, grinders, and other equipment used to make other machines were crucial for industrial development. Before the war, Japan had produced some machine tools domestically, but relied heavily on imports of advanced equipment from Germany, Switzerland, and the United States. During the war, Japanese companies developed domestic machine tool capacity to support military production. After the war, this capacity was available for conversion to civilian use. The occupation initially restricted some types of precision equipment that could have military applications, but these restrictions were gradually relaxed. Japanese machine tool manufacturers, including companies like Makino, Mori, Seiki, and Okuma, began producing equipment for domestic use and eventually export. The industry benefited from Japanese craftsmen's traditional skills in precision work, which translated well to modern machine tool production. Engineers and machinists who had produced equipment for military aircraft and weapons now applied their expertise to civilian manufacturing. The machine tool industry's growth supported the development of automotive, electronics, and other manufacturing sectors by providing the equipment needed to produce high-quality goods efficiently. By the late 1950s, Japanese machine tools were beginning to compete with European products in quality and price, laying the foundation for Japan's later dominance in precision manufacturing equipment. The ceramics and pottery industry illustrates how traditional Japanese crafts adapted to modern markets during the occupation period. Japanese ceramics had a long history and high reputation, with various regional styles and techniques developed over centuries. During the war, pottery production had focused on military items like insulators and chemical vessels, with luxury ceramics production suspended. After the war, potters returned to producing traditional wares but also sought new markets. The occupation forces created demand for souvenir ceramics, plates, cups, figurines, and decorative items that American servicemen could send home. This market encouraged mass production of tourist ceramics, often of questionable quality, but profitable. Simultaneously, serious potters continued traditional practices, creating high-quality wares using traditional techniques and aesthetics. The Japanese government and cultural organizations promoted traditional ceramics as examples of Japanese cultural achievement, supporting master potters and encouraging preservation of traditional methods. American interest in Japanese culture, sparked partly by the occupation, created markets for Japanese ceramics in the United States. Importers began bringing Japanese pottery to America, where it found audiences among middle-class consumers attracted to Japanese design aesthetics. The ceramics industry's bifurcation into tourist kitsch and serious art would continue in subsequent decades, with Japan producing both cheap export wares and internationally acclaimed art ceramics. The development of Japan's electrical equipment industry during the occupation period created capacity that would later support the consumer electronics boom. Companies like Hitachi, Toshiba, and Mitsubishi Electric had produced military electrical equipment during the war, including radar, radio equipment, and fire control systems. After the war, they converted to producing generators, transformers, motors, and other industrial electrical equipment needed for reconstruction. The companies also began producing consumer appliances, radios, fans, washing machines, refrigerators for the domestic market. These products were initially expensive and available only to wealthy Japanese, but as production increased and costs fell, they became accessible to more consumers. The electrical equipment industry benefited from American technical assistance, licensing agreements that provided access to American technology, and growing domestic and international demand. Engineers who had worked on military radar and communications during the war applied their expertise to civilian radio and early television equipment. The industry's growth provided employment for thousands, contributed to electrification and modernization of Japanese homes and factories, and created capabilities that would later be applied to transistors, televisions, and other consumer electronics that would make Japanese companies world leaders. The occupation period saw the foundation being laid for this future success, though the full flowering would come later. The rebuilding of Japan's railway system required not just physical reconstruction but also organizational reform and modernization. The Imperial Japanese Railways had been a government monopoly before and during the war, controlling most of the country's rail network. The occupation authorities, influenced by American skepticism about government ownership of industry, considered privatizing the railways but ultimately decided that this was impractical given the system's complexity and importance. Instead, the occupation reformed railway management, introducing more transparent accounting, improving labor relations, and investing in reconstruction of damaged infrastructure. Railway workers, organized in powerful unions, struck repeatedly for better wages and working conditions, creating conflicts between the unions and management that sometimes disrupted service. The occupation authorities mediated these disputes with mixed success, trying to balance workers' rights with the need for reliable transportation. The railways gradually restored and expanded service, electrifying more lines, replacing steam locomotives with electric and diesel power, and improving tracks and stations. Japanese National Railways, created in 1949 as a government corporation with more autonomy than the previous government department, operated most of the national network, while private railways served urban and regional markets. The efficiency, safety, and punctuality that would later make Japanese railways famous began to develop during this period, driven by engineering excellence, dedicated workers, and a national culture that valued precision and reliability in transportation. The insurance industry's transformation during the occupation demonstrates how American legal concepts were adapted to Japanese conditions. Insurance had existed in Japan before the war, but it had been heavily regulated and controlled by a few major companies with close government connections. The occupation authorities introduced American-style insurance regulation, creating a more competitive market and stronger consumer protections. Insurance companies were required to maintain adequate reserves, file rates with regulators, and treat policyholders fairly. New companies entered the market, increasing competition and innovation. Life insurance became more widely available as companies developed products suited to Japanese incomes and needs. Property insurance helped Japanese rebuild after fires, floods, and other disasters common in a country with wooden construction and natural hazards. The insurance industry's growth supported economic development by providing mechanisms for managing risk and encouraging investment. Japanese adapted American insurance concepts while maintaining some distinctively Japanese practices, creating a hybrid system that combined elements of both traditions. By the 1950s, Japan had a sophisticated insurance industry that served domestic needs and was beginning to expand into other Asian markets. The emergence of Japan's advertising industry during the occupation period reflected and accelerated cultural change. Before the war, advertising had been limited and constrained by wartime controls that prohibited promotion of consumer goods and required advertising to support military objectives. After the war, as consumer goods production resumed and companies competed for customers, advertising became crucial to business success. Japanese advertising agencies, including Dentsu and Hakuhodo, which had survived the war by producing propaganda, now competed to create effective commercial advertising. They studied American advertising techniques, adapted them to Japanese culture and media landscape, and developed innovative approaches that combined Western methods with Japanese aesthetics and psychology. Magazine and newspaper advertising flourished as publications multiplied and readership expanded. Radio advertising created new possibilities for reaching audiences with commercial messages. The content of advertising reflected changing. Japanese society ads featured women in Western clothes, promoted labor-saving appliances, sold products using appeals to modernity and progress. Advertising both reflected and shaped cultural change, promoting consumption and Western-influenced lifestyles while adapting messages to Japanese values and sensibilities. The industry's growth during the occupation period laid groundwork for the sophisticated advertising culture that would characterize post-war Japan. The construction industry's transformation during the occupation period involved not just rebuilding what had been destroyed, but also introducing new materials, techniques, and building codes. Japanese construction had traditionally used wood as the primary material, with buildings designed to withstand earthquakes through flexibility rather than rigid strength. This approach had served Japan well for centuries but created vulnerability to fire, as demonstrated by the devastating firebombing of Japanese cities during the war. The occupation authorities promoted concrete and steel construction as safer and more modern, though cost and resource constraints meant that most buildings continued to be built with wood for years. Building codes were reformed to incorporate Western safety standards while adapting them to Japanese seismic conditions. Construction companies, ranging from large firms capable of building multi-story buildings to small contractors building family homes, learned new techniques and materials. The construction boom created enormous demand for labor, employing millions in physically demanding work that required minimal skill but offered better wages than many alternatives. Construction workers rebuilt Japan's cities, often living in primitive conditions on construction sites while erecting buildings for others. The industry's growth, while essential for reconstruction, also created problems including labor exploitation, organized crime involvement in labor supply, and environmental degradation from quarrying and logging to supply materials. But without the construction industry's efforts, Japan's physical reconstruction would have been impossible. The rebuilding of Japan's physical infrastructure was as crucial as any political reform. American bombers had reduced Japan's cities to rubble, destroying not just military targets but entire urban landscapes. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities had been gutted by incendiary raids that created firestorms consuming everything in their paths. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had left those cities as nuclear wastelands where nothing grew, and radiation sickness claimed victims for years after the initial blasts. Millions of Japanese lived in makeshift shelters, bombed-out buildings, or shantytown slums constructed from salvaged materials. The immediate post-war period saw extraordinary scenes of people living in subway stations, under bridges, in parks, anywhere they could find shelter from the elements. Women and children scavenged through ruins looking for anything salvageable, anything that could be sold or used. The black market flourished in the chaos, with desperate people trading family heirlooms for rice, selling their bodies for food, doing whatever was necessary to survive. The occupation authorities faced the enormous task of providing housing, restoring utilities, clearing rubble, and rebuilding basic infrastructure. American engineers worked with Japanese counterparts to restore electricity, water, and sewage systems. The Japanese government, with occupation approval and sometimes American funding, began massive public works projects to rebuild roads, railways, ports, and bridges. The scale of the destruction was so vast that progress seemed painfully slow at first. But gradually, order emerged from chaos. Rubble was cleared, temporary housing was constructed, utilities were restored, and cities began to function again. The cultural impact of the occupation extended into areas that Americans never consciously targeted, but which changed nonetheless through contact with American ideas and values. Japanese cinema provides a striking example. Before the war, Japanese films had been heavily censored, with strict requirements to promote patriotism, military values, and traditional morality. Films could not show kissing, could not question authority, could not suggest that Japan might not win the war. Directors and screenwriters who violated these rules faced arrest. The occupation imposed its own censorship, banning films that promoted militarism or feudal values, while allowing or encouraging films that promoted democracy and individual rights. American films flooded into Japan, exposing audiences to Hollywood's depiction of romantic love, individual freedom, and material abundance. The contrast with wartime Japanese cinema could not have been starker. Japanese filmmakers, freed from militarist censorship but subject to occupation approval, began exploring themes that had been forbidden. Directors like Akira Kurosawa, Yasujiro Ozu, and Kenji Mizoguchi created films that examined Japanese society with unprecedented honesty and criticism. Kurosawa's No Regrets for Our Youth, released in 1946, portrayed the brutal suppression of liberals during the 1930s and the courage of those who resisted militarism. Such a film would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The occupation censors approved it because it criticized the old regime, not recognizing how it also implicitly questioned any form of authoritarian control, including American occupation. Japanese audiences responded enthusiastically to the new freedom in cinema, making stars of actors who played independent, thoughtful characters, rather than mindless soldiers or obedient women. Baseball offers another fascinating window into cultural change under occupation. The sport had been introduced to Japan in the late 19th century and had become enormously popular, with professional leagues operating before the war. But during the war, baseball was suppressed as an American sport, enemy contamination of Japanese purity. Players were drafted into military service, stadiums were damaged by bombing, and the professional leagues suspended play. When the occupation began, American troops brought baseball with them as recreation, playing games on improvised diamonds and inviting Japanese to watch or participate. The sight of American soldiers playing baseball reminded Japanese of their own pre-war love of the game and suggested that perhaps America was not entirely alien or hostile. General MacArthur actively promoted baseball as a way to build goodwill and demonstrate American culture. Professional baseball resumed in 1946, with teams reorganizing and playing before enthusiastic crowds, who saw the games as a return to normalcy and a link to the pre-war world. American players occasionally joined Japanese teams or played exhibition games, demonstrating techniques and creating personal connections. The sport became a metaphor for the occupation itself, a competition conducted according to rules requiring skill and teamwork, with clear winners and losers but also mutual respect. Japanese players adopted American techniques while maintaining Japanese approaches to training and discipline, creating a hybrid style that would eventually surpass American baseball in some respects. The success of Japanese baseball would later become a source of national pride and a symbol of Japan's ability to absorb foreign influence while maintaining its own identity. The role of the Japanese Communist Party during the occupation illustrates the limits of American tolerance for democratic outcomes. The occupation freed political prisoners, including communist leaders who had spent years in jail for opposing the war. The Japan Communist Party, which had been brutally suppressed during the 1930s and 1940s, suddenly found itself legal and even encouraged as part of the democratization process. American officials initially saw the communists as allies in dismantling the old order, fellow opponents of militarism and feudalism. The communists emerged from prison with enormous moral authority as the only political group that had consistently opposed the war. They attracted intellectuals, labor activists, and young people seeking radical change. Party membership grew rapidly, and communist-influenced unions became dominant in many industries. Communist candidates won seats in the Diet and controlled some local governments. But as the Cold War intensified and American policy shifted, tolerance for the communists evaporated. MacArthur, who had initially protected them, now ordered a purge of Communist Party leaders and members from public life. The Red Purge of 1949 and 1950 removed thousands of communists from government jobs, schools, and private industry. Communist-led labor unions were broken up or taken over by more moderate leaders. The party was not banned outright, but it was systematically weakened and marginalized. The contradiction was glaring. The occupation that claimed to promote democracy was suppressing a legal political party because American authorities disliked its ideology. Japanese communists bitterly noted the hypocrisy, but they had little recourse. The episode demonstrated that occupation democracy had limits defined by American Cold War interests. Infrastructure development continued throughout the occupation, with increasing Japanese involvement and decreasing American control. The railway system, which had been heavily damaged by bombing and years of deferred maintenance, required massive investment to restore and modernize. Japanese engineers, working with limited resources but considerable ingenuity, rebuilt rail lines, bridges, and stations. They maintained many of the steam locomotives and coaches that had survived the war while beginning to plan for electrification and modernization. The efficiency and punctuality of Japanese railways, which would later become world famous, began to develop during this period as a matter of necessity in a country where railways provided the primary means of long-distance transportation. Roads were in even worse condition than railways, with many paved roads destroyed and few vehicles available in any case. The occupation authorities and Japanese government gradually rebuilt the road network, though the real boom in road construction would come later with the growth of automobile ownership. Ports required urgent attention because Japan depended completely on maritime trade for survival. American engineers helped restore port facilities at Yokohama, Kobe, Osaka, and other major cities, dredging channels, rebuilding docks, and installing modern cargo handling equipment. The restoration of port capacity enabled the resumption of international trade and the import of food and raw materials essential to recovery. How did ordinary Japanese people experience the occupation? The answer varied enormously depending on where they lived, their social class, their political views, and their personal experiences. For some, particularly in Tokyo and other cities with large occupation forces, Americans were a daily presence. Has walked the streets, patronized bars and restaurants, formed relationships with Japanese women, and distributed chocolate and chewing gum to children. Many Japanese, especially children and young people, found Americans fascinating. They were so tall, so loud, so casual in their manners, so generous with their wealth. The American soldiers seemed to have an abundance of everything. Food, cigarettes, money, confidence. This contrasted sharply with the Japanese experience of poverty and defeat. Some Japanese women formed relationships with American servicemen, relationships that ranged from prostitution to genuine love affairs to marriages. These women, known pejoratively as pan-pan girls when they were prostitutes or onri when they had American boyfriends, faced harsh social judgment from other Japanese who saw them as traitors or prostitutes, regardless of the nature of their relationships. Children born of these relationships, sometimes called konketsuji or mixed-blood children, faced discrimination and struggled to find acceptance in a society that prized racial homogeneity. For Japanese people living in rural areas or smaller cities without major American presence, the occupation was more abstract. They knew Americans controlled the country and that major changes were happening, but their daily lives involved farming or working in local industries with little direct contact with occupation forces. These Japanese experienced the occupation primarily through the reforms it imposed: land redistribution, women's suffrage, educational changes, and economic policies that filtered down from Tokyo. Some embraced these changes eagerly, while others resented them as foreign impositions that violated Japanese traditions. The black market deserves extended attention because it dominated economic life during the early occupation years. Official rations provided barely enough food to survive, perhaps 1,300 calories per day when active adults needed more than twice that. Workers could not live on official rations alone, so they turned to the black market to supplement their diet. Nearly everything was available on the black market if you had money or something to trade: rice, vegetables, meat, fish, clothing, tools, building materials, luxury goods. Prices were astronomical compared to official prices, but people paid them because the alternative was starvation. The black market operated in specific areas of cities, with the UNO district in Tokyo becoming particularly notorious. Vendors set up stalls selling everything imaginable, often goods stolen from American military supplies or Japanese government warehouses. The occupation authorities officially opposed the black market and occasionally raided it, but they also tacitly accepted it as necessary for survival. Police conducted periodic crackdowns that arrested a few vendors and confiscated some goods, but the market always reopened within days. Some occupation officials quietly patronized the black market themselves, buying Japanese antiques, silk kimonos, and other items at bargain prices from desperate Japanese who needed money for food. The black market gradually declined as the official economy recovered and rationing was relaxed, but it remained significant until the early 1950s. The experience of living in a society where everyone regularly violated the law to survive had complex effects on Japanese attitudes toward authority and legality. It taught pragmatism and flexibility, but also undermined respect for rules and regulations. Repatriation of Japanese military personnel and civilians from overseas presented one of the occupation's greatest logistical challenges. When Japan surrendered, approximately 6 million Japanese were stranded outside the home islands. These included soldiers and sailors in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, civilian administrators and settlers in former colonies, and technical personnel who had been working on industrial projects across the empire. The process of bringing them home, called hikiage or repatriation, took years and required enormous shipping capacity. American naval vessels and commandeered Japanese ships transported millions of Japanese from ports across Asia back to Japan. The returnees arrived in various conditions. Some had been well treated by the forces that accepted their surrender. Others had suffered terribly, particularly those repatriated from the Soviet Union. The Soviets had captured approximately 575,000 Japanese in Manchuria and northern Korea in the final days of the war, and transported them to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. These prisoners worked in mines, forests, and construction projects in brutal conditions. Approximately 60,000 died from cold, starvation, disease, or overwork before the survivors were repatriated between 1946 and 1950. The returning prisoners brought stories of horror that fueled Japanese resentment against the Soviet Union and contributed to Japan's firm alignment with the United States during the Cold War. The returnees also created massive social and economic challenges. They needed housing, food, jobs, and integration into a society that had changed profoundly during their absence. Many found their homes destroyed, their families dead or scattered, their pre-war lives impossible to resume. Some turned to crime, creating gangs that controlled black market operations or engaged in violent conflicts over territory and spoils. The development of Japanese industry under occupation provides crucial context for understanding the later economic miracle. In the immediate post-war period, most factories stood idle or operated far below capacity. Shortages of raw materials, destroyed equipment, disrupted transportation, and lack of capital all constrained production. Coal mines, essential for powering industry, struggled to produce enough fuel because miners were malnourished and equipment was worn out. Steel production required coal and iron ore, but both were in short supply. Without steel, factories could not make machines, tools, or products. The economy was caught in a vicious cycle where nothing could be produced because nothing else was being produced. The occupation's priority production system, implemented in 1946, attempted to break this cycle by concentrating resources on key industries. Coal production received priority allocation of food, materials, and labor. Increased coal production would enable increased steel production, which would enable increased production of everything else. The policy worked, though slowly. Coal production gradually increased, steel. Mills resumed operation and industrial output began to recover. But the real transformation came with the reverse course and the Korean War boom. When American procurement orders flooded in, Japanese companies suddenly had customers, capital, and access to American technology and management techniques. Companies sent engineers and managers to the United States to study American production methods. They learned about quality control, efficiency analysis, statistical process control, and other techniques that American industry had developed during World War II. These Japanese engineers and managers returned home and adapted American methods to Japanese conditions, often improving on them in the process. The Toyota production system, which would revolutionize manufacturing worldwide, had its origins in this period of learning and adaptation. The transition from occupation to independence began with the San Francisco Peace Treaty negotiations in 1951. By this time, American policy had completely shifted from punishment to partnership. The United States wanted Japan as a stable, prosperous, anti-communist ally in Asia, a counterweight to Communist China and the Soviet Union. The peace treaty was designed to end the occupation while ensuring continued American influence and military presence. The treaty was remarkably lenient, requiring no reparations to the United States and imposing few restrictions on Japan's sovereignty. Many Asian nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation protested the leniency, arguing that Japan should pay for the damage it had inflicted. But the United States, which dominated the treaty negotiations, prioritized Cold War strategy over historical justice. The Soviet Union and Communist China were not invited to participate in the treaty negotiations, ensuring that they could not obstruct American plans. The San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed on September 8, 1951, by Japan and 48 allied nations. On the same day, Japan and the United States signed the Mutual Security Treaty, which granted the United States the right to maintain military bases in Japan and obligated the United States to defend Japan from attack. These twin agreements defined Japan's post-war international position, formally independent but militarily dependent on the United States, economically free to pursue growth but politically aligned with American Cold War objectives. Shigeru Yoshida signed both treaties on behalf of Japan, cementing his reputation as the architect of post-war Japanese foreign policy. His approach, balancing between American demands and Japanese interests, accepting military dependence while pursuing economic independence, became the template for Japanese diplomacy for decades. Critics on the left denounced the treaties as perpetuating American imperialism and preventing true Japanese independence. They particularly opposed the continued presence of American military bases, which they saw as making Japan a target in any future war between the United States and communist powers. Massive protests erupted against the treaties, with hundreds of thousands of demonstrators surrounding the Diet building and clashing with police. But Yoshida and the conservative majority in the Diet ratified both treaties, and they took effect when the occupation officially ended on April 28, 1952. The occupation was over, but American influence would continue through military bases, economic ties, and the political relationships established during the occupation years. What happened to the various American officials who shaped the occupation? General Douglas MacArthur left Japan in April 1951, not because the occupation ended, but because President Truman relieved him of command for insubordination regarding the conduct of the Korean War. MacArthur had wanted to expand the war into China and had publicly criticized Truman's limited war strategy. Truman, asserting civilian control over the military, removed MacArthur and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway. MacArthur returned to the United States as a hero to many, receiving a tumultuous welcome and addressing a joint session of Congress with his famous line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." He briefly considered running for president in 1952, but quickly faded from the political scene, living in quiet retirement in New York until his death in 1964. MacArthur's departure from Japan occasioned genuine emotion among many Japanese, who, whatever their private views, appreciated that he had treated them with relative respect and had prevented the vindictive, punitive occupation that could have occurred. Thousands of Japanese lined the streets as his motorcade drove to the airport, many weeping openly as the Supreme Commander departed. The legacy of the occupation continues to shape Japan and Japanese-American relations to this day. The constitution imposed in 1947 remains in force, unrevised despite numerous attempts to amend or replace it. Article 9 remains particularly contentious, with conservatives arguing it prevents Japan from playing a normal role in international affairs, while progressives defend it as a sacred commitment to peace. The self-defense forces, created in the 1950s despite Article 9's prohibition on military forces, have grown into one of the world's most capable militaries through creative interpretation of what constitutes self-defense. American military bases remain in Japan, particularly in Okinawa, where they occupy about 20% of the island's land area and generate continuing controversy and resentment. The economic system developed during the occupation and refined in subsequent decades made Japan the world's second-largest economy by the 1970s and 1980s, though it has since been surpassed by China. The social reforms of the occupation, particularly regarding women's rights, education and labor unions, fundamentally changed Japanese society, even as some traditional attitudes and practices persisted. The question of how to remember the war and the occupation remains contested in Japan, with different groups promoting different narratives about what happened and what it means for Japanese identity. The retail industry's evolution during the occupation period reflected changing consumer behavior and economic recovery. Before the war, Japanese shopping had been dominated by small neighborhood shops where customers had personal relationships with shopkeepers and often bought on credit. Department stores existed in major cities, offering wider selections but serving primarily wealthy customers. During the war, most goods were rationed and shopping meant standing in queues for limited quantities of poor quality items. After the war, as production resumed and rationing gradually ended, retail transformed. Black markets evolved into legitimate street markets where vendors sold everything from food to clothing to household goods. Department stores reopened and modernized, adopting American-style merchandising techniques and expanding product ranges. Some stores, damaged by bombing, relocated or rebuilt with modern fixtures and layouts. The concept of self-service shopping, standard in America, but new to Japan, was gradually introduced, though many Japanese preferred the personal service of traditional shopkeepers. New retail formats emerged, including supermarkets that offered lower prices through higher volume and reduced service. The retail transformation both reflected and accelerated cultural change, with stores promoting new products and lifestyles while adapting to Japanese preferences and shopping habits. The experience of shopping changed from a relationship-based activity to a more anonymous, price-driven transaction, though traditional neighborhood shops remained important, especially for older Japanese who valued familiar faces and credit relationships. The hotel industry's development during the occupation period responded to needs created by American presence and growing business activity. Before the war, Japan had had a modest hotel industry serving domestic tourists and business travelers, plus some Western-style hotels in major cities, catering to foreign visitors. Most Japanese traveled infrequently and, when they did, stayed in traditional inns called ryokan rather than hotels. The war devastated the hotel industry, with buildings damaged, converted to military use, or requisitioned by the occupation forces. After the war, American military personnel and officials needed accommodation, creating demand for Western-style hotels with amenities Americans expected. Some existing hotels were commandeered for occupation use, forcing their owners to serve American guests according to American standards. Other hotels operated independently, catering to American servicemen on leave who wanted entertainment and female companionship. These hotels sometimes operated as fronts for prostitution, with hotel staff, facilitating encounters between servicemen and Japanese women. The occupation authorities officially discouraged prostitution, but tacitly tolerated it as preventing worse abuses. As the occupation progressed and Japanese business activity increased, demand for hotel accommodation by Japanese business travelers grew. New hotels were built or existing buildings converted to meet this demand. The hotel industry adopted American concepts of service and amenities while maintaining Japanese elements like restaurants serving Japanese food and some traditional decorative touches. By the occupation's end, Japan had a modernizing hotel industry ready to serve the growing tourism and business travel that would characterize the post-war economy. The entertainment industry's transformation during the occupation combined American influence with Japanese innovation. Before the war, Japanese entertainment had included kabuki and other traditional theater, movies, music halls, and geisha entertainment for wealthy patrons. During the war, entertainment was restricted and controlled, with performers expected to support the war effort and avoid anything deemed frivolous or Western. After the war, entertainment exploded in new directions. American jazz, which had been banned during the war as enemy music, became wildly popular, with Japanese musicians forming jazz bands and clubs opening in cities where American servicemen and Japanese civilians could listen and dance. American movies flooded Japanese theaters, exposing audiences to Hollywood glamour, romance, and American lifestyle. Japanese film studios resumed production, initially subject to occupation censorship but gradually gaining more freedom. Directors explored themes that had been forbidden during the war, creating films that examined Japanese society with unprecedented honesty. The entertainment industry employed thousands of performers, musicians, technicians, and support workers, providing livelihoods and creating culture that both reflected and shaped post-war Japanese society. The industry's growth during occupation created infrastructure and talent pool that would support Japan's later emergence as a major cultural exporter. The domestic service industry's transformation during the occupation period reflected changing social relations and economic conditions. Before the war, wealthy Japanese families had employed servants, often young women from poor rural families who worked in city households for low wages. Domestic service was a major source of employment for young women who sent money home to support their families. The war disrupted this system as servants were mobilized for war work or military support. After the war, the shortage of housing and economic hardship meant fewer families could afford servants, while democratic values promoted by the occupation made some Japanese uncomfortable with the master-servant relationship. Gradually, domestic service declined as an institution, with former servants finding work in factories, shops, and offices that offered better pay and more dignity. Families that could afford help increasingly hired workers by the hour for specific tasks rather than employing live-in servants. This shift reflected and accelerated changing social attitudes about hierarchy and proper relationships between classes. The decline of domestic service as a major employment category represented progress toward a more egalitarian society, though it also meant that some tasks previously done by servants now fell to housewives, increasing their workload as family sizes decreased and household technology remained limited. The banking industry's restructuring during the occupation period created the financial system that would support Japan's later economic growth. Before the war, Japanese banking had been dominated by large banks affiliated with zaibatsu, which provided capital to member companies and exercised considerable influence over the economy. The occupation's dissolution of zaibatsu extended to their banks, which were required to sever formal ties with industrial companies and operate independently. The Bank of Japan, the central bank, was reformed to reduce government control and increase its independence, though it remained responsive to government priorities. Commercial banks were restructured to separate lending functions from investment banking, following American models designed to prevent the kind of bank failures that had devastated the American economy during the Great Depression. The reforms created a banking system with more specialized institutions and clearer separation of functions, though in practice Japanese banks maintained close relationships with industrial companies through informal ties and cross-shareholding. The banking system provided capital for reconstruction and later growth, channeling Japanese savings into productive investment. Interest rates were controlled to keep them relatively low, favoring borrowers over savers but enabling companies to obtain capital cheaply for expansion. The system worked well for decades, supporting rapid growth, though it would later create problems when bad loans accumulated and banks protected failing companies rather than forcing needed restructuring. The social welfare system's development during the occupation period created safety nets that had not existed before. Before the war, Japanese social welfare had been minimal, with families expected to care for their own members and charity organizations providing limited assistance to those without family support. The war had created millions of widows, orphans, disabled veterans, and others unable to support themselves. The occupation authorities, influenced by American New Deal concepts of social welfare, promoted creation of government programs to assist the needy. The Livelihood Protection Law of 1946 provided means-tested assistance to those unable to work or support themselves. Public health programs provided medical care to the poor. Orphanages and institutions cared for children whose parents had died in the war. Veterans' benefits provided pensions and medical care to disabled former soldiers, though at levels well below what American veterans received and subject to political controversies about whether those who had fought for the militarist regime deserved support. The social welfare system created during occupation remained limited compared to European welfare states, reflecting both Japanese cultural preferences for family responsibility and limited government resources, but it established principles and institutions that would gradually expand in subsequent decades as Japan's economy grew and resources became available. The welfare system helped prevent complete destitution and enabled economic recovery by ensuring that workers and their families had minimal security. The transformation of Japanese food culture during the occupation period combined necessity, American influence, and Japanese adaptation. Food shortages dominated the immediate post-war period, with millions surviving on barely adequate rations supplemented by black market purchases and foraging. As food supplies improved, Japanese diet began to change. Bread, which had been rare before the war, became more common as American wheat shipments arrived and bakeries opened. Milk and dairy products, never significant in traditional Japanese diet, were promoted as healthy, especially for children. American soldiers introduced Japanese to chewing gum, chocolate, and other American foods, creating tastes that Japanese food companies would later satisfy. School lunch programs introduced during occupation with American food aid exposed children to foods and flavors different from traditional Japanese cuisine. The long-term impact was a more varied Japanese diet that incorporated Western elements while maintaining core Japanese foods like rice, fish, and vegetables. The transformation was gradual and incomplete, with many Japanese continuing to eat primarily traditional foods, while younger Japanese and urbanites adopted more Western-influenced diets. The occupation period began a process of dietary change that would continue for decades, eventually producing the hybrid food culture of modern Japan, where traditional and Western foods coexist and influence each other. The postal system's restoration during occupation period provided essential communication infrastructure for a dispersed population. The war had disrupted postal service, with facilities damaged, workers drafted, and mail delayed or lost. After the war, Japanese desperately needed postal service to contact family members separated by war, to conduct business, and to maintain social relationships. The occupation authorities recognized that postal service was essential to reconstruction and supported its restoration. Post offices reopened, mail delivery resumed, and postal workers labored to handle enormous volumes of mail as Japanese searched for missing relatives and re-established connections disrupted by war. The postal savings system, where Japanese could deposit small amounts and earn interest, was revived and became crucial for mobilizing domestic savings for reconstruction. Postal savings accounts offered security and convenience, especially for rural Japanese who lived far from banks. The postal system also served social functions, with post offices serving as community centers where people gathered, exchanged news, and conducted business. Postal workers, respected for their education and government employment, served as important figures in local communities. The restoration of reliable postal service contributed to economic recovery and social reconnection after war's disruptions. The bicycle industry's growth during occupation period provided essential transportation in a country with limited automobiles and recovering public transit. Before the war, bicycles had been common in Japan, used for commuting, errands, and recreation. During the war, bicycles were requisitioned for military use or fell into disrepair as parts and materials became unavailable. After the war, bicycles were essential for workers commuting to jobs, for housewives shopping for scarce food, for students traveling to school. bicycle manufacturers rebuilt production capacity and struggled to meet enormous demand. Quality was often poor due to material shortages, with bikes featuring wooden wheels or makeshift parts when steel and rubber were unavailable. As materials became available, quality improved and production increased. Japanese bicycle companies developed efficient manufacturing techniques and began producing bicycles for export as well as domestic use. The bicycle boom created employment in manufacturing, retail, and repair shops. It also shaped urban planning and social patterns, with Japanese cities developing bicycle parking areas and pathways, and with bicycle use becoming a defining feature of Japanese urban life. The occupation period saw bicycles become ubiquitous in Japanese cities, a pattern that would continue even as automobile ownership later increased. The reform of the police box system during occupation period modernized community policing while maintaining some traditional elements. The koban, or police box, where one or two officers maintained continuous presence in neighborhoods, had been a feature of Japanese policing since the 19th century. Officers in koban knew their neighborhoods intimately, maintained detailed records on residents, and served both law enforcement and social service functions. During the war, police boxes had been instruments of surveillance and control, with officers monitoring residents for dangerous thoughts and reporting suspicious activity. The occupation authorities considered abolishing the police box system as too conducive to oppressive monitoring, but ultimately decided to reform it instead. Police boxes were maintained, but officers were retrained to provide service rather than surveillance, to protect rights rather than enforce thought control. The koban system proved valuable for maintaining public order, preventing crime through visible presence, and providing assistance to lost children, traffic directions, and other community services. Foreign observers of Japanese policing would later cite the koban system as contributing to Japan's remarkably low crime rates and as a model for community policing that other countries should emulate. The occupation period transformed police boxes from instruments of repression to tools of community service, though some critics argue that surveillance functions were reduced but never completely eliminated. The long-term economic impacts of occupation reforms reveal a complex picture of success, adaptation, and unintended consequences. The land reform created millions of small landowners who became a conservative political force supporting the Liberal Democratic Party that would dominate Japanese politics for decades. These farmers, grateful for land they never thought they would own, voted consistently for conservative politicians who had often opposed the reforms initially but now claimed credit for them. The irony was not lost on Japanese leftists who had supported the land reform as a step towards social equality, but found that it had strengthened the political right by creating a property-owning rural class. The dissolution of the zaibatsu, intended to promote competition, instead evolved into the keiretsu system of cross-shareholding and mutual obligation among related companies. The keiretsu maintained many of the old zaibatsu relationships, but in more flexible forms that avoided formal holding companies. Banks became the centers of these groups, providing capital and coordination. The system combined aspects of American capitalism with Japanese traditions of mutual obligation and long-term relationships. It enabled rapid capital mobilization and technology sharing within groups, while insulating companies from hostile takeovers and short-term market pressures. Whether this system was more or less efficient than pure market competition remains debated, but it undeniably contributed to Japan's rapid growth in the 1960s and 1970s, before creating problems in the 1990s when bad debts and inefficiency led to prolonged economic stagnation. The educational reforms produced generations of Japanese who grew up with different values and worldviews than their parents. Students educated under the post-war system learned about democracy, human rights, and critical thinking. They questioned authority more readily than previous generations and developed more individualistic attitudes. This created generational conflicts in families and workplaces as young people clashed with elders who retained pre-war values of hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. The education system also became extraordinarily competitive, with students studying intensively to pass entrance examinations for prestigious high schools and universities. This examination system, while producing high academic achievement, created enormous pressure on students and contributed to various social problems including truancy, bullying, and youth suicide. The system's focus on rote memorization and test preparation, ironically, began to resemble the pre-war education system in some ways, despite the occupation's intentions to promote critical thinking and creativity. Critics argued that Japanese education had successfully eliminated militaristic content while retaining authoritarian methods and stifling conformity. Defenders pointed to Japan's high literacy rates, strong mathematical and scientific education, and successful economic development as evidence that the system worked. The cultural transformation of Japan extended into daily life in ways that Americans could never have mandated. Clothing styles changed as Western dress became standard for business and many social occasions. Traditional Japanese clothing like kimono became reserved for special occasions rather than everyday wear. Dietary habits shifted as bread, meat, and dairy products became more common, supplementing the traditional rice-based diet. These changes were not imposed by occupation fiat, but emerged through exposure to American culture, rising living standards, and Japanese choices to adopt aspects of Western lifestyle. The transformation was never complete, with Japanese maintaining many traditional practices in modified forms. The tea ceremony, flower arranging, martial arts, and other cultural practices adapted to modern life while retaining their essential character. Japanese architecture evolved to incorporate Western elements while maintaining Japanese aesthetic principles. The result was a hybrid culture that was distinctively Japanese while incorporating foreign influences, much as Japan had done throughout its history with Chinese, Korean, and other Asian influences. The development of democratic political culture proved more difficult than implementing democratic institutions. The 1947 Constitution created a parliamentary system with regular elections, freedom of speech and press, and protection for civil liberties. But political practice often diverged from constitutional ideals. Money politics, where politicians distributed cash and favors to secure support, became endemic. Political parties functioned more as factions united around powerful leaders than as ideological movements organized around principles. Voters often supported candidates based on personal relationships and material benefits rather than policy positions. Bureaucrats who had maintained continuity through the occupation continued to wield enormous power behind the scenes, drafting legislation and making policy, while elected politicians provided democratic legitimacy. The Liberal Democratic Party, formed in 1955 from the merger of conservative factions, would govern almost continuously until 1993, creating a de facto one-party system despite competitive elections. Opposition parties existed, but rarely threatened LDP dominance, leading some observers to describe Japan as a democracy without alternation of power. Whether this system represented a Japanese adaptation of democracy or a failure to fully embrace democratic principles remained contested. Defenders argued that Japan had achieved political stability, economic growth, and social harmony, even if its democracy looked different from American or European models. Critics charged that the system perpetuated elite rule, stifled genuine political competition, and failed to hold politicians accountable for corruption and failure. The legacy of the war crimes trials continues to generate controversy, both in Japan and internationally. Some Japanese view the trials as victor's justice, noting that American firebombing of Japanese cities and the atomic bombings killed far more civilians than most atrocities for which Japanese were executed. They point out that no Americans faced trial for these actions, suggesting that the trials applied double standards based on who won the war. Others argue that the trials were necessary but insufficient, that many who should have been prosecuted escaped justice, and that the decision to shield Emperor Hirohito from prosecution undermined the trial's moral authority. Historical research has revealed that Unit 731, which conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners in Manchuria, was granted immunity by American occupation authorities in exchange for sharing its research data. The United States wanted the biological warfare research and was willing to protect war criminals to get it. This deal, kept secret for decades, reinforced Japanese skeptics' view that the trials were about power and politics rather than justice. The continuing controversy over the Yasukuni Shrine, where executed war criminals are enshrined alongside other war dead, reflects unresolved questions about guilt, responsibility, and how to remember the war. When Japanese prime ministers visit Yasukuni, neighboring countries that suffered under Japanese occupation protest vehemently, viewing the visits as honoring war criminals. Japanese conservatives defend the visits as honoring all who died for Japan, arguing that the war criminals were victims of unfair trials and should be mourned like any other war dead. The shrine controversy illustrates how the occupation's attempt to impose historical memory through war crimes trials had limited success in creating consensus about the war's meaning. The status of women in post-war Japan reveals both the achievements and limitations of occupation reforms. Women gained legal equality, political rights, and access to education and careers that would have been unimaginable before the war. The first generation of women to benefit from these reforms included teachers, journalists, lawyers, and politicians who broke barriers and served as role models. But social attitudes and practices changed more slowly than laws. Many companies refused to hire women for career track positions, relegating them to clerical work and expecting them to resign when they married or had children. The ideal of the woman as full-time housewife and mother remained powerful, supported by tax policies and corporate practices that assumed male breadwinners and female homemakers. Women who tried to combine career and family faced enormous challenges due to lack of childcare, long work hours, and social disapproval. The gap between legal rights and social reality created frustration among women who had been promised equality but found themselves constrained by persistent discrimination. Gradually, over decades, women's status improved as more women pursued higher education and careers, as laws against discrimination were strengthened, and as social attitudes evolved. But even today, Japan ranks poorly in international comparisons of gender equality, with women underrepresented in politics, corporate leadership, and other positions of power. The occupation planted seeds of change but could not immediately overcome centuries of patriarchal tradition. The transformation of Japanese industry from wartime production to peaceful manufacturing deserves detailed examination. Companies that had built fighter planes and battleships during the war faced the challenge of converting to civilian production or going out of business. Mitsubishi, which had produced the Zero fighter and other military aircraft, shifted to producing buses, trucks, and eventually automobiles. The expertise in precision manufacturing and quality control developed for military production transferred readily to civilian goods. Other companies faced harder transitions. Nakajima Aircraft, one of Japan's largest aircraft manufacturers, was broken up during the Zaibatsu dissolution, and its components became Fuji Heavy Industries, Prince Motor Company, and other firms that eventually merged with or competed against other automakers. The shipbuilding industry, which had built the Imperial Japanese Navy, converted to building merchant ships, tankers, and eventually became the world's dominant shipbuilding nation in the 1960s and 1970s. The textile industry, which had been Japan's main export industry before the war, recovered quickly and became important again in the 1950s before being displaced by higher-value manufacturing. The electronics industry emerged almost from nothing, with companies like Sony and Matsushita starting small and growing rapidly by producing radios, televisions, and other consumer goods. These companies benefited from access to American technology through licensing agreements, from American quality control methods, and from growing domestic and international demand for consumer electronics. The question of what ordinary Japanese learned from the occupation experience reveals diverse answers. Some concluded that military power and imperial conquest were futile and immoral, that Japan's proper role was as a trading nation pursuing prosperity through peaceful competition. This view supported the Yoshida doctrine of military minimalism and economic focus. Others drew more cynical lessons, that power matters more than justice, that the strong impose their will on the weak, that Japan had lost because it was weaker than America, not because its cause was wrong. This view fed into nationalist resentment and historical revisionism. Many Japanese simply wanted to forget the war and occupation and move forward, focusing on rebuilding their lives and their country. The popular desire to focus on the present and future rather than dwelling on the past contributed to what some critics call Japanese historical amnesia about the war. Unlike Germany, which engaged in intensive reflection on Nazi crimes and German responsibility, Japan as a society never fully confronted the war crimes committed in its name or the militarist ideology that led to disaster. The occupation's decision to work through existing elites and preserve the emperor meant that continuity with the pre-war and wartime periods remained stronger than in Germany, where the Nazi state was completely destroyed. This continuity had advantages for stability and economic recovery, but disadvantages for moral reckoning and historical understanding. The role of Japanese intellectuals during the occupation highlights the complexity of political and cultural change. Some intellectuals enthusiastically supported occupation reforms, seeing them as an opportunity to implement ideas they had developed but could not advocate during the militarist period. Philosophers, economists, and political scientists who had studied Western democracy during the 1920s now found themselves able to publish freely and influence policy. They participated in drafting new textbooks, writing for newly uncensored journals, and teaching the younger generation about democracy and human rights. Other intellectuals felt conflicted, welcoming some reforms while resenting the occupation as a national humiliation. They appreciated freedom from militarist repression, but disliked being dictated to by foreign conquerors. Some became Marxists, attracted to an ideology that criticized both Japanese militarism and American capitalism. The Japan Communist Party and Socialist Party drew support from intellectuals who saw them as alternatives to both the discredited militarists and the American-dominated conservatives. The debates among intellectuals during the occupation period laid the foundation for political and cultural divisions that would persist for decades, with conservatives defending Japanese traditions and American alliance, leftists criticizing both capitalism and American imperialism, and centrists trying to chart a middle course. The experience of Okinawa under American occupation differed significantly from that of the main Japanese islands. Okinawa, which had been the site of one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles in 1945, came under direct American military government rather than indirect rule through Japanese institutions. The United States kept Okinawa under military control until 1972, decades after the rest of Japan regained sovereignty. During this period, American forces used Okinawa as a major military base, expropriating land for bases and treating the islands as essentially American territory. Okinawans had no say in this arrangement despite being Japanese citizens. They suffered from noise, crime, and accidents related to the massive American military presence while receiving little benefit. The delayed return of Okinawa to Japanese sovereignty created lasting resentment among Okinawans, who felt they had been sacrificed to American military interests and Japanese government indifference. Even after reversion to Japanese control in 1972, the American bases remained, continuing to burden Okinawa disproportionately. The concentration of American military forces in Okinawa, which is less than 1% of Japan's land area, but hosts over half of American forces in Japan, remains a contentious political issue that reveals the complicated legacy of the occupation and the continuing American military presence. The public health initiatives undertaken during the occupation contributed significantly to Japan's reconstruction. American military doctors and public health experts worked with Japanese counterparts to combat tuberculosis, typhoid, and other diseases that had been endemic in Japan and had worsened during the war due to malnutrition and collapsed sanitation systems. Mass inoculation campaigns vaccinated millions of Japanese against smallpox, diphtheria, and other preventable diseases. Nutrition programs, especially for children and pregnant women, addressed the malnutrition that had left much of the population weakened and vulnerable to disease. These efforts required not just medical supplies and expertise, but also the rebuilding of public health infrastructure, clinics, hospitals, water purification systems, and sewage treatment. The occupation's public health legacy contributed to Japan's dramatic improvement in life expectancy and infant mortality rates in the post-war decades. Japanese life expectancy increased from about 50 years in 1947 to over 80 years by the end of the 20th century, one of the fastest improvements in human history. While economic growth and improved nutrition deserve much of the credit, the public health infrastructure established during the occupation period provided the foundation. The transformation of the Japanese police state into a society with relatively strong civil liberties remains one of the occupation's most significant achievements. Before and during the war, Japanese lived under constant surveillance and control. Speaking against the government or emperor could result in arrest, torture, and imprisonment. Thought police monitored citizens for dangerous ideas. Neighbors were organized into mutual surveillance groups that reported suspicious activity. Books, films, and newspapers were heavily censored. Academic freedom was non-existent, with professors fired or arrested for teaching ideas that conflicted with official ideology. The occupation dismantled this apparatus of control, abolished the special hire police, purged thousands of police officers, and established legal protections for civil liberties. The new constitution guaranteed freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. It prohibited censorship and unreasonable searches. It established judicial independence and due process rights. These protections, once established, proved remarkably durable, even after the occupation ended. Japanese enjoy freedom of speech and press comparable to other advanced democracies. Political dissent is tolerated and even vigorous. The transformation from police state to free society within a few years represents a remarkable achievement, though one should note that the occupation itself practiced censorship and suppressed some forms of political expression, particularly by communists, showing the limits of its commitment to absolute freedom. The economic role of the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, established in 1949, illustrates how occupation reforms created space for Japanese innovation in economic management. MITI, as it became known, coordinated industrial policy, guided investment, and helped Japanese companies compete internationally. It represented a middle path between American-style free markets and Soviet-style command economies, using government guidance and coordination to achieve economic goals while leaving companies privately owned and operated. MITI identified strategic industries, helped companies access capital and technology, protected infant industries from foreign competition while pushing them to become internationally competitive, and sometimes brokered cooperation among companies to avoid destructive competition. Western economists debated whether MITI was essential to Japanese economic success or whether Japanese companies would have succeeded anyway, but MITI became a model for other Asian countries pursuing industrial development. The ministry's success challenged American assumptions about the superiority of pure free markets and suggested that strategic government intervention could accelerate economic development under certain conditions. The occupation had not intended to create institutions like MITI, which contradicted American free market ideology, but by breaking up the zaibatsu and promoting competition while leaving Japanese bureaucrats in place, it created conditions where new forms of economic coordination could emerge. As the occupation drew to a close and Japan prepared for independence, both American and Japanese officials engaged in mutual reassessment of what had been achieved. American officials tended to view the occupation as a great success that had transformed Japan from militaristic enemy to democratic ally. They pointed to the democratic constitution, women's rights, land reform, labor unions, free press, and political parties as evidence of genuine democratization. They noted Japan's economic recovery, its peaceful absorption of millions of repatriates, and the absence of major unrest or violence against occupation forces. They congratulated themselves on conducting an enlightened occupation that had won Japanese cooperation rather than resistance. Japanese officials offered more nuanced assessments. They appreciated that the occupation had been relatively benign compared to what might have been, that Americans had not engaged in widespread looting, rape, or murder as Japanese propaganda had predicted. They acknowledged that some reforms, particularly land reform and women's rights, represented genuine improvements that benefited millions of Japanese. But they also resented the imposition of reforms without Japanese consultation, the arrogance of some American officials who treated Japanese as children requiring re-education, and the contradiction between American professions of democracy and the authoritarian nature of occupation rule. Many Japanese viewed the reforms instrumentally, accepting them as necessary to end the occupation and regain sovereignty rather than as embodying superior values. This pragmatic acceptance would characterize Japanese attitudes toward American influence in the post-war period. Cooperation where beneficial, resistance where possible, and always a calculation of national interest rather than ideological commitment. The question of war responsibility and how Japanese society should remember the war remained unresolved at the occupation's end and continues to generate controversy. The occupation had purged militarist leaders, conducted war crimes trials, and attempted to re-educate the Japanese people about the war's causes and character. But it had also preserved the emperor, worked through conservative elites, and ultimately prioritized stability over thorough denazification-style reform. The result was a society without clear consensus about the war. Some Japanese accepted the view that Japan had been the aggressor, that its invasion of China and surprise attack on Pearl Harbor were unjustified, that the atrocities committed by Japanese forces were real and deserving of condemnation. Others clung to the belief that Japan had fought a defensive war against Western imperialism, that the war crimes trials were unfair, that atrocities had been exaggerated or fabricated. Still others simply wanted to forget the whole experience and focus on the future. The occupation had imposed one narrative through censorship and propaganda, but this narrative had not fully taken root in Japanese consciousness. When the occupation ended and censorship was lifted, alternative narratives began to emerge, leading to the history textbook controversies, Yasukuni shrine disputes, and comfort women debates that would trouble Japanese relations with its neighbors for decades. The personal stories of individual Japanese who lived through the occupation reveal the human dimension of historical transformation. A farmer in rural Kyushu who received land through the land reform might have experienced the occupation as fundamentally positive, giving him property and opportunity his ancestors had never known. A former Imperial Navy officer who lost his pension and faced difficulty finding work might have experienced it as unjust punishment for serving his country. A young woman who gained the right to vote, attend university and pursue a career might have seen the occupation as liberation from stifling tradition. A conservative father watching his daughter adopt Western fashions and question his authority might have seen it as moral decay imported by the occupiers. A factory worker who joined a union and struck for higher wages might have viewed it as finally getting a fair share. A factory owner forced to negotiate with that union might have resented occupation policies that empowered workers. These diverse experiences, multiplied across millions of individuals, created a complex social reality that defies simple characterization. The occupation transformed Japan, but the transformation meant different things to different people and created winners and losers, beneficiaries and victims of change. The long-term relationship between the United States and Japan that emerged from the occupation has been remarkably stable despite periodic tensions. The bilateral security alliance has endured for over 70 years, making it one of the longest-lasting alliances in modern history. American forces remain based in Japan, particularly in Okinawa, providing security while generating continuing controversy. Economic ties have been both cooperative and competitive, with periods of close partnership alternating with trade friction and rivalry. The cultural influence flows in both directions, with American popular culture profoundly influencing Japan, while Japanese anime, manga, video games, and cuisine become increasingly influential in the United States. The relationship is not between equals. American power remains far greater, but it has evolved beyond the simple victor-vanquished dynamic of the occupation period. Japanese resentment of American dominance coexists with appreciation for American security guarantees and market access. American frustration with Japanese trade practices and base politics coexists with respect for Japanese economic achievement and strategic importance. The relationship is complicated, sometimes contradictory, but fundamentally stable and mutually beneficial in ways that seemed impossible in 1945 when the occupation began. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that you gained a deeper understanding of how the American occupation helped rebuild Japan after World War II. The transformation of Japan from a devastated militaristic enemy into a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous ally stands as one of history's most remarkable achievements. If you enjoyed learning about this fascinating period of history, make sure to check out our other videos about World War II and the post-war period. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more historical content. We have many more stories to tell about this crucial period in world history, so we'll see you in the next one.